Let's talk tides of brutal greenskin violence, cobbled together war machines, and fearsome squid cavalry. We're talking about how to start orcs in Warhammer 40k 10th edition. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking orcs, and in particular talking about starting an orc army from a standing start in the new edition of the game. Orcs are a pretty fun army to collect and paint and put on the tabletop. Really characterful miniatures and kind of iconic of the setting of Warhammer 40k in general, and are a very popular army for a good reason. In this video we'll talk about the reasons that you might want to collect an orc army, how you might think about planning out a force, a few ideas and hints for buying first purchases, and then how to expand a greenskin horde from there. Loads to talk about, so let's jump straight in. So first of all, why might you want to collect orcs in the first place? Perhaps one of the main reasons is that orcs are just really quite fun, arguably a lot more so and a bit more light-hearted than a few of the other very serious factions in Warhammer 40k, making war for the sheer joy of it. Greenskins gleefully charging into battle to chop up their enemy at the head of great wars, big war bosses marshalling their mechs and forces to stomp the stars flat. The orc way of war tends to be very practical and rough and ready, getting their warriors towards the front. Lots of pretty simplistic war gear with your simple chopper axes, various very loud guns called shooters throwing some big projectiles towards the enemy, mechs welding great creations of orky effigies and walkers that tower towards the sky all made from scrap, and taming great big fungoid squig beasts and riding them towards the battle as cavalry. When orcs take to the field, it's usually with unbridled aggression, charging the enemy and not steering away from a fight, though there's all sorts of orcs with their own special obsessions and interesting ways of making war, though most of them tend to do so in great numbers. Miniatures wise, orcs I think are in really quite a good place in Warhammer 40k, a fairly big model range with more choices than the majority of factions in the game, and quite a few of them are fairly nice high quality plastic kits, the range having a decent range refresh in 9th edition. A few bits from their lineup are a little bit outdated, things like the tank busters with their old resin finecast kit, and there's a couple of their resin characters that aren't currently on sale, but range-wise I'd argue that they're perhaps doing better than most. They do have some distinct sub-themes in their army as well, lots of units that operate differently, though there is a subset of beast snagger orcs in the army, the ones that like trapping and riding great monsters into battle, and the speed freak buggies, which are often like orcs doing Mad Max basically. Very spiky dragsters and racers zooming their way across the board to take the fight to the foe. To take a look at a few models, here on the left we've got the Squighog Boyz cavalry. They're beast snaggers and they come with their rocket propelled sticker spears, plus the really quite cool grot riding a bomb squig who has a bit of a death wish. Topping in the centre we've got a Gorkanaut, one of the bigger orky walkers, pretty scary in combat and also belching out a whole bunch of shots with that Deathstorm mega shooter. And on the bottom right we've got the standard Boyz, often armed with either shooters or slugger and chopper, your standard horde troops making their way towards the enemy, often in big numbers. For a few more, here's one of the speed freak buggies, this one a shock jump dragster, a bit of anti-tank with a shock rifle, and also teleporting round the board with its curious shock tunnel rule. There's a big mech with a shock attack gun front and centre here. A very weird mech creation that teleports snot things through a tunnel in the warp to emerge inside their foes, often with devastating results. And on the top right, here are the Storm Boys, curiously militant and disciplined orcs that nonetheless prefer to get to battle attached to a great big rocket pack, zooming through the air to take the fight to the enemy at speed. Price-wise, I'd say that orcs are fairly standard within Warhammer 40k, neither massively more expensive nor massively cheaper than most armies. I think they do depend a little bit on exactly how you choose to collect them really. Getting a bunch of their newer and shinier plastic kits often would tend to cost a bit more, maybe not for all that many points, say things like those speed freak buggies. Perhaps part of the reason is that quite a lot of the orc units don't tend to be massively elite, so you might need quite a few of them. On the other hand though, orcs really are a great army for kit bashing. There's really quite a lot of scope for taking other kits or other things that you can find cheaply and orcifying them and turning them into other things. If you enjoy a bit of plastic art assembling or are willing to chop some kits up and use them creatively, you can often get a fair bit more value there than you might have been able to otherwise. It feels all very appropriate doing that, given that the orcs basically do that themselves with other bits of scrap. Rules-wise, their current rules are found for download in their index on Warhammer Community. At least currently, the army is a bit more slanted towards just playing hyper-aggressively and taking lots of combat units. Their launch attachment makes melee flat stronger, and their faction rule is calling the war boss calling out a great war cry, and orcs surging across the field into close combat, being able to advance and charge and get a bit better when they get there. Some shooting units are good, but I think it's fairly safe to say that it isn't usually the main focus of the codex right now. Power-wise, I'd say they're doing okay but not standout. They've got a fairly middle-of-the-pack win rate in 40k tournaments, though it does feel that within the index there is really quite a lot of stuff that's kind of underpowered, even if a few of the best units can carry them fairly effectively. Hopefully a few of those imbalances will be partly sorted out by Games Workshop's balance passes though. Fingers crossed for at least a little bit of the less overwhelming stuff getting a bit of a bump. So if you do choose to collect an army of hyperviolent greenskins to put on the tabletop there, you can move on to planning an army and deciding what sort of force you'd like. Perhaps one of the best places to start with getting an idea of how the army functions on the table is Index Orks, at time of recording freely downloadable from Warhammer Community under the download section. Pretty helpful to get an idea of how the army would play and which sort of units you might like to field. For building army lists, you can try out Battlescribe or Warhapedia when they update, plus Games Workshop's app can be used to put together some forces and see what a army list of certain sizes would entail. And you could always do an element of trying before you buy, maybe try the faction on Tabletop Simulator if you're into that, or proxying models in person to see whether or not you like the feel of the army on the board. There's all manner of content that you can watch on YouTube relating to orcs. I made a few orcs videos myself, including a tier list and an index overview. I'll leave those links down in the video description, and I'm sure there'll be more to talk about for the orcs as we go on through 10th edition. There's absolutely tons of other content on YouTube though, battle reports, painting guides, and lore in abundance on other channels. It's definitely a bit easier to get inspired and really get into an army if you're seeing other people use them in action, or learning about their mentality and mindset and their lore. Otherwise, there's plenty of places that you can ask questions on social media. Orcs have good representation from both Discord servers, subreddits, and Facebook groups. Really quite nice just to check in on a few of those from time to time. It's an easy way to ask some experienced players a few basic things for advice, plus just imbibe a lot of the questions that people playing the faction have. You learn quite a lot through osmosis. When applying this all to your own force, you could probably try and get a rough sort of idea as to what sort of goal you're aiming for. Certainly nothing wrong with just jumping straight into it with a few fun kits, but you can decide as to what sort of army archetype you might want to build around, whether it's going to be a balanced orc clan, maybe a huge horde known as a green tide, a dread mob with a whole bunch of dreadnoughts, killer cans, and bigger walkers. You can play around speed freaks with loads of orcs in trucks, buggies, and bikes, maybe a bunch of battle wagons with death rollers, and have mega knobs and things jump out of them, things that might have been called a blitz brigade in the past, or go really quite heavy into the savage tribal orc sort of aesthetic that the beast snaggers have. You could build around one of those orky archetypes, or maybe theme your army around one certain orc clan and the way that they make war in the lore, or just go for what's working in game at the moment for the orcs, and what other things that you just generally like the idea of the models on the tabletop. I think early on it's probably worth drafting an initial 500 point list and maybe a 2000 point very rough target for experimenting on. Doesn't have to be anything set in stone, but could just give you an idea of what you might be looking at initially. From there I think I'd get my hands on some orcs and maybe paint up a test model or two. Perhaps something like a standard orc boy or beast snagger boy might be one of the best places to jump into the army with. Get a bit of a handle on the basic troopers and the way that you're going to do things like the orc's green skin, any of their cloth and fabric and armor parts, before moving forward to tackle some bigger and badder models. For the most part I'd say that orcs at least tend to be at least fairly straightforward to paint, really quite lend themselves to things like dry brushing and contrast paints if you want to make some use of them. Lots of organic and material type things lend themselves quite well to that. It perhaps can be just a little bit less obvious if you make some minor mistakes and things with orcs. They generally tend to have a bit of rough and ready appearance anyway. Just for some idea on colour schemes and clans and things, here are perhaps the 7 major orc clans in Warhammer 40k, each of which has their own lore, personalities, and fighting styles, though currently they don't really have any sort of in-game rules differences right now. Previously, in 9th edition and before, you might say have Goths fight very differently to Bad Moons model to model. But in 9th edition, Games Workshop's tried to make it so the colour that you've painted your army isn't going to reflect the rules too much, which does have its positives as well as negatives, as you can just basically pick the colour that you like the most. Going through them individually, and Death Skulls are the lucky blue gits who like to loot other orcs' stuff, stealing things and getting their mechs to cobble it back together with some big shooting technology. Snakebites tend to be slightly more savage and tribal orcs like in the old ways, and seem to be quite well represented by some beast snagger models I think. Goths perhaps are the epitome of might is right. They have no mucking about, and often tend to have some of the mightiest boys and knobs in the army. Freebooters are basically orky pirates, often guns for hire operating out of kill cruisers led by their captains into battle. Bad Moons have teeth that go faster than other orcs, so often have the way to buy more things than their fellows. They like snazzy technology and lots of dakka. Blood Axes are spooky sneaky orcs. They've got a good liking for commandos and forming over elaborate battle plans. They quite enjoy their camo designs as well. And finally Evil Sons perhaps epitomise the speed freak way of orcs. going very fast towards the enemy with the firm belief that red ones go faster. They might like to have a lot of bikes and buggies in their list. For the first purchases for the Orky army, at the moment you can get away with not really getting too much in terms of the army rules or background on them if you'd like. Most of the time in Warhammer 40k, when there's a codex available for an army, it's usually a good place to start, but 10th edition doesn't have an Ork codex yet, and it seems like one's not going to come along until at least next summer and maybe later. Though this perhaps has some positives and negatives for the Orks, might mean that they don't get an update for a while, but any of the units that you get based on their current rules should be good for a fair while at least, though it will be fun when they get their codex and get different detachments to epitomise different Orky ways of war. If you can find them, you could think about picking up the index cards for the army. These are basically the same things that you can digitally download from Games Workshop on those PDFs, but it can be nice to have the hard copy if you can find them, though Games Workshop have sold out of these in a few places around the world. You might be able to find some either second hand or in third party sellers perhaps. They can be nice enough if you can find them. Quite nice to have some hard copies of the rules to hand as well as just on your phone or something. The Warhammer 40k app can be another way to get your hands on rules as well. Free at the moment, though at some stage they are going to start charging for it. If you just want some lore and general background of the greenskin army and something physical to read, you could think about picking up past codexes for them. They tend to be really quite cheap on the internet. Maybe looking for one of the last few on eBay could be worth it. When the Orks Codex does release for 10th edition though, that's probably going to be fairly necessary to play the army. Maybe one of the best places to start when that comes out. Otherwise, for the most exciting thing about jumping into an army, you can think about your first Orky miniature buys. Depending on what sort of army you're playing, I think my first instinct would be to pick up something like a simple infantry kit, either some Boyz or Beast Snagger boys to start with perhaps. Quite nice for painting up some test models and likely to be fairly useful as the army's strength waxes and wanes. The other option would be to find a discount box to get lots of models in one place a little bit cheaper than Games Workshop would sell them normally, and the main choice for that at the moment would be Combat Patrol Orks. That's the only one that's firmly in their range. There are a few past discount boxes you might be able to find as well, things like Boarding Patrol Orks, the Christmas Battle Force box set, and the Beast Snaggers launch box, which we'll talk about in just a second. Otherwise though, if there's anything that you just find particularly cool or inspiring, no reason not to pick it up early really. If something like a great big battle fortress with a death roller is going to be the first thing that you want, or some sneaky commando gits from their rather excellent kill team kit, it's always nice to have something motivational to paint up. While we're on the subject of Ork Boys boxes though, I'd bear in mind that there's 3 different sets at the moment, perhaps something that's not immediately obvious to newer players. The one in the middle and the one on the left basically represents the standard Ork Boys mob, the more traditional one with a knob with a power claw, and then one Ork with a special weapon, whether it's a shooter or rocket or something. And they generally tend to have the option of either shooters or sluggers and choppers. Both of these kits do have positives and negatives. The one on the left costs a little bit more for 10 boys, and unfortunately the loadout of the boys is completely locked, so you get, I believe it's 3 with shooters, 1 with a big shooter, and the rest with sluggers and choppers. But compared with the other one, this is a far newer kit. The boys' models are bigger and chunkier, and maybe a little bit more violent and dangerous looking, I think, and they don't have quite the same sort of squat hunched over pose that the ones in the middle do. Otherwise, the kit in the middle is a bit cheaper and comes with 11 boys rather than 10. Maybe not enormously helpful with Games Workshop's points cost being fixed per unit, but extra boys models is handy enough to have other squad fillers and options for different units. These ones do have a full selection of weapons though, despite being the older models. You can equip all of them with either sluggers and choppers or shooters should you wish. I think it isn't the worst to have a mix and match though. Orks in the lore do come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. I still think that they look pretty reasonable when ranked up next to each other. Otherwise, the ones on the right are the Beast Snagger boys, a bit more tribal in appearance with bits of squig hide all over them, and they've got quite a lot of chain axe choppers within the unit. They're a little bit more expensive even than the regular new set of boys, £35 or $60 for the 10 of them here. These guys have a different datasheet in game, maybe a little bit more standout than the regular boys rules wise right now, but not by loads I think. Before we move on to the Combat Patrol, bear in mind the various options for buying 40k miniatures in general. Again, perhaps something that isn't super obvious for newer players who might just go direct to Games Workshop only. That's usually one of the more reliable ways. They tend to have better stock than some places, though things still can go out of stock for some time. But around the world, if you are looking to economise a bit, you can generally save some fairly solid amounts compared with Games Workshop's stock prices, often usually in the region of somewhere between 10 and 20%. If you order through an online store or at a local gaming store, you can usually save around that much. For example, there's Element Games in the UK, Noble Knight Games in the USA, or Gap Games in Australia. All of those are linked down in the video description, basically getting the exact same models as Games Workshop, but at a discount. Those are affiliate links as well and do help out the channel if you buy anything through them, though it doesn't cost you any extra to do so. Stores like that are usually my first port of call if looking for newer kits. Otherwise though, you can often find plenty of orcs on the second-hand market. They're an established faction that's been around for a long time, so eBay can often be well worth a look. Quality might be variable, but that could be one way of getting a lot of orcs for the horde in one fell swoop. And there are plenty of options for model sculpts outside of Games Workshop that fit the bill as well. 3D printing is getting ever more diverse with more designs, and there are some third-party manufacturers that make their own sculpts of orc miniatures that could certainly do in a pinch to rival Games Workshops. It can be nice just for aesthetic upgrades, or even just saving a bit of money compared with Games Workshop's prices. One of the first places that a lot of people will look to when starting an Orcs army though is Combat Patrol Orks. This is basically the Orc discount box set from Games Workshop at the moment, £95, €125 or $160, a fairly big box of Orcs that gets you around about a 40% discount compared with buying these separately. In the box set you get a war boss with mega armor, 2 units of the newer Boyz kit, the one with the slightly chunkier models and fewer of them, but the more fixed options where you don't get to swap out between shooter or slugger, 3 Death Copters and a Death Dread. In the box that gets you around about 530 points, so a decent chunk towards getting an Orc army on the tabletop, and it also allows you to play the actual Combat Patrol game for Orcs as well. Games Workshop's small game system, where you play with an army right out of the box and see how it ranks up against another army for the same game mode. Overall, miniatures wise and appearance wise, I think it is a fairly solid starter set. I do basically like all the miniatures in the box. They're all really quite recent besides the Death Dread, who I think still holds up, though admittedly the bugbear about not being able to give the Orc boys the right armament is kind of annoying. At time of recording, I must admit I'd say the majority of units in the box aren't super strong in game. The boys are definitely usable enough, though I'd argue that perhaps the other choices might compete a little bit poorly compared with other things in the Orcs index. They're not unplayably bad if you're playing at a more casual level than a competitive one. If I were collecting Orcs, I would absolutely still pick up a box set of these though. It's a nice little core that gets you a set of units to build around and some good flexibility. I do like the way that you get a Horde bit, some fast boys on the Death Copters, plus a Stompy Walker. It feels like a nice mix really. Otherwise, for past discount sets that you might see out in the wild, there's Boarding Patrol Orcs, the Beast Snagger Boys Launch Box, or the Kildaka Warband. Boarding Patrol Orcs was at least a fairly recent set. This was the one that Stickrock came out in, and it includes some interesting things like the Beast Snagger Boys and the Flash Gits too, plus a set of the relatively recent Kill Team Commandos box set, which I think is a rather good one. Really quite nice if you can get your hands on one of these at a fairly cheap price. This would be another very tempting way to get a whole bunch of greenskins on the table, and works fairly nicely with the Combat Patrol, I think. Otherwise, the Beast Snagger launch box was the launch box for the 9th edition Orcs Codex. It does have some outdated data cards and a codex in it, though it does get you a bunch of Squighog Boys, Beast Snaggers, and Zogrod Wart Snagger. And the Kildaka Warband is an old Christmas box set, a fairly good mix of units, including a Daka Jet and a Death Killer Wartrike, all a little bit unreliable to get a hold of though, given that they're not sold directly from Games Workshop anymore. Otherwise though, either think about starting with the Combat Patrol set or get a few core units on the tabletop, whether it's characters, infantry, or a few stompy war machines, and then once you've got a small core force established, you can start expanding the army to greater heights. In 40k, I think there's always a good scope for just collect what you like the look of, as 40k rules do tend to change over time, and things get better or worse in points. But I think it doesn't hurt a little bit to tailor things towards things that tend to be a bit more effective in game and might see more table time in the short term, particularly if you like the unit to start with. Just running down a few of the more effective Orky units at the moment, I'd be quite tempted to pick up some Gretchen at some point. These diminutive stunty greenskin goblins are pretty fun little models to have in their own right, really quite cool and iconic. But in game right now, they make pretty excellent objective grabbers with a whole bunch of models for not that many points, plus they generate command points as well, which is always handy to have in the army. A couple of units I think are almost auto-include. Otherwise, trucks are really quite nice transports for getting boys or knobs into battle. Perhaps some of the scariest bosses are either the Beast Boss on the Squigosaur or Mozrog Scragbad. They're really very tanky and very fighty in combat as well, pretty brutally mighty there. Orcs at the moment are very melee focused, so it usually makes sense to have a hearty contingent of elite melee damage dealers to beat down the enemy's best troops. Things like Squighog Boys, Knobs, Mega Knobs, or Beast Snagger Boys are perhaps some of the most efficient at this right now, often picking up things like a War Boss or Beast Boss to lead them into battle, or maybe a big mech in Mega Armor for those Mega Knobs. Battle Wagons and Kill Rigs I think are both okay fortresses to charge into battle and have the greenskins jump out of. Mech guns are really quite efficient firepower right now, and flash kits are okay. Bear in mind that mech guns are hideously expensive for the points though, a lot of people like to convert them, and having a few objective snatching units is kind of handy, things like the commandos for some forward deployment, or maybe storm boys for their really big charges and just fast movement in general. Currently in game, I'd say that quite a lot of the buggies and walkers are fairly underpowered right now. Hopefully Games Workshop will give them a little bit of a helping hand at some stage. As mentioned earlier, think about some sort of rough end goal in mind for a 2000 point army if you want to take them that far. And usually when collecting a 40k army, I tend to buy units individually or in small chunks and then get them up, painted up, and have games with them. Might be a little bit more sensible than buying loads and loads of grey plastic at once and having a massive great big pile of shame that you never get through. Finally, just to showcase one example of a strong orc list at the moment, here's one army that had featured on the channel previously, this one by Chance Hallinan, who used it to take 7th at the Boyz Cup, going 4 wins to 1 loss and a tournament of 50 people. This one does look like a really nice and aggressive greenskin army list, lots of melee units piling forward and taking the fight to the foe. Gaskell Thrasher himself is leading the boys into battle. He looks like he's joined by a unit of 6 mega knobs, so really quite a scary melee unit there. There's 2 units of Beast Stagger boys, probably jumping out of those couple of kill rigs there to chop up the enemy on midfield objectives. There's 6 Squighog boys cavalry, who are quite good at killing vehicles and monsters with their anti-keyword. There's a unit of commandos who can set up in the midfield and are fairly good in combat themselves, potentially doing first turn charges, and they look like they're with Boss Snickrot, the boss that's got precision melee attacks with Mork's teeth. One of the Beast Stagger boys units has a beast boss with the Cunning but Brutal warlord trait. There's 10 Storm Boys for some very fast long-range charges, and there's a couple of mech guns both with custom mega cannons. They're really quite efficient general-purpose anti-tank weapons, not a lot of points, and can really put in a decent amount of shooting for their cost, I think. Finally, there's a unit of 10 Gretchen, seemed like a really good unit to have on a home field objective, just rustling up command points all game long, and being really quite cheap to hold down one place. Looks like a nice fun list, I think. Lots of greenskin bodies to have to deal with, and toughness 5 can be a little bit annoying for plenty of armies, and just so many units that are going to cause absolute carnage if they get to melee. In any case, hope that's helped for a little bit of inspiration with getting a force of orcs together on the tabletops of Warhammer 40k. If you've got any other ideas or tips for newer players, feel free to share them down in the comments. Any other ideas for getting a force of orcs together are greatly appreciated. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming, and if you'd like something else to watch for the orcs next, I'll leave a link to the index overview video that I've made, and that'll be down in the video description. There'll also be a tier list there as well, ranking how strong the orc units are at time of recording. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel and you'd like to help support keeping them coming, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you found this useful or you just want to support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.